Hello, everyone. The rain was relentless, pelting against the windshield in heavy sheets as I sat in the back seat of the taxi, staring blankly at the city lights blurred by the downpour. It was late, and I was returning home after yet another exhausting day at the office. The fluorescent lights of the high-rise buildings cast a cold glow on the empty streets, reflecting the emptiness I felt inside. "Everything all right back there, sir?" The taxi driver's voice pulled me out of my thoughts. He was a middle-aged man, slightly graying at the temples, with a thick accent and a casual air about him. I'd ridden with him before, Michael, I think his name was, and he always seemed a little too familiar, but I appreciated the normalcy of our routine. "Yeah, just tired," I replied, forcing a polite smile. He nodded, glancing at me through the rearview mirror, as if assessing my mood. The rain continued to drum on the roof of the taxi, filling the silence that settled between us. I turned my attention back to the window, my mind drifting to Beth, my wife. She'd been distant lately, her once warm demeanor replaced by a coldness I couldn't quite place. I shook off the unease that was becoming all too familiar and tried to focus on the comforting thought of finally being home. We pulled up to our apartment building, and I handed Michael a tip, more out of habit than gratitude. He accepted it with a nod, his eyes lingering on mine a moment longer than usual. I dismissed the thought and made my way up to our apartment. The soft glow of the lamp in the living room greeted me as I opened the door. Beth was sitting on the couch, her legs curled up beneath her as she scrolled through her phone, barely acknowledging my entrance. I dropped my bag by the door and approached her, leaning down to kiss her cheek. "Hey," I said softly, but she pulled away slightly, pretending to be engrossed in whatever was on her screen. "Hey," she responded, her tone flat and indifferent. I tried to hide my disappointment and made my way to the kitchen to pour myself a drink. I could feel her eyes on me, but when I turned around, she was back to her phone, completely detached from the world around her. "Rough day?" I asked, trying to make conversation as I took a sip of the whiskey that burned its way down my throat. "Just the usual," she replied, not looking up. I wanted to ask her what was wrong, why she seemed so distant, but something in her demeanor made me hesitate. Instead, I just nodded, unsure of what else to say. The silence between us was suffocating, a thick tension that had been growing for months now, but I didn't know how to break it. The next few days followed the same routine. I'd leave for work early, come home late, and Beth would always be there, physically present but emotionally absent. Her phone had become an extension of her hand, and she was constantly texting, though she never mentioned who she was talking to. I tried to ignore the gnawing suspicion that something was off, telling myself that she was just stressed or that I was overthinking things. But then one night, something changed. I came home earlier than usual, hoping to surprise her with dinner from her favorite restaurant. I was excited, looking forward to a quiet night together, but as I reached our building, I saw her stepping out of a taxi, the same one I always took. She didn't notice me at first, her laughter ringing out as she leaned in close to the driver, her hand resting on his arm. There was an intimacy in the way she touched him, something I hadn't seen between us in months. My heart sank as I watched her, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. "Beth!" I called out, my voice trembling with a mix of confusion and anger. She froze, her smile disappearing as she slowly turned to face me. The driver, Michael, glanced at me with a look of recognition, his expression unreadable. Beth's face turned pale as she quickly stepped away from the car, fumbling for an explanation. I was just getting a ride back from the store," she stammered, her eyes darting between me and Michael. I looked at her, then at Michael, who was now avoiding my gaze. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment, none of us moved. I wanted to believe her, to brush off the unease that was growing inside me, but something about the way she looked at him, the way she lied so easily, sent a chill down my spine. "Sure," I said finally, forcing a smile. "I brought dinner. Let's go inside." She hesitated, glancing back at Michael, who gave her a brief nod before driving off. I watched the taxi disappear into the night, a strange feeling settling in the pit of my stomach. As we walked up to our apartment, Beth remained silent, her eyes focused straight ahead, avoiding mine. That night, as I lay in bed next to her, I couldn't shake the image of her and Michael together. There was something more between them, something she wasn't telling me, but I didn't have the strength to confront her, not yet. Instead, I lay there in the dark, my mind racing with possibilities, each one more painful than the last. I wanted to trust her, to believe that she wouldn't betray me, but deep down, I knew that things weren't right. The woman lying beside me was a stranger, and the life we had built together was starting to feel like a lie. As sleep finally claimed me, I couldn't help but wonder how long I had been living in the dark, blind to the truth that was now staring me in the face. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. The next few days passed in a blur of unease and suspicion. Beth was her usual distant self, but now, every smile she offered seemed forced, every touch laced with guilt. I found myself watching her closely, searching for signs of the truth I feared. But life went on. We went through the motions, pretending everything was fine, though I could feel the cracks in our relationship widening with every passing day. Beth started going out more, always with some excuse about meeting friends or running errands. And every time she left, that familiar taxi was waiting for her. One evening, I decided to confront her. The nagging doubt had grown too big to ignore, and I needed answers. But when I got home, Beth was already gone. A note on the kitchen table informed me she was out with friends and wouldn't be back until late. And my heart pounded in my chest as I paced the living room, the silence of the apartment amplifying my anxiety. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that there was a perfectly logical explanation for everything. But the memory of her laughing with Michael, the way she had touched his arm so casually, wouldn't leave my mind. I couldn't sit still any longer. Grabbing my keys, I headed out the door, not entirely sure what I was going to do but knowing I couldn't just wait around any longer. I had to see for myself. The rain had returned, heavier than before, and by the time I reached the street, I was drenched. I didn't care. The rain matched the storm brewing inside me, a mix of anger, fear, and a desperate need for the truth. I drove around the city, unsure of where to start, but something inside me urged me on. I thought about calling her, but I knew it wouldn't help. If she was with him, she'd lie again, and I couldn't bear to hear it. After what felt like hours of driving aimlessly, I finally spotted the taxi parked outside a small, rundown motel on the outskirts of town. My heart sank. I parked a short distance away and watched as the door to one of the rooms opened. Beth stepped out, pulling her coat tight around her, followed by Michael. They were laughing, but it wasn't the carefree laughter I remembered from our early days. It was something else, something that made my blood run cold. I felt a surge of anger, my fists clenching around the steering wheel. They were standing so close, their faces inches apart, oblivious to the world around them. I watched as Michael leaned in, whispering something in her ear, making her giggle like a schoolgirl. She looked up at him with an expression I hadn't seen in months, an expression she used to reserve for me. Before I knew what I was doing, I was out of the car and walking toward them, the rain drenching me to the bone. They didn't notice me until I was almost on top of them, and when they did, their smiles faded instantly. "Beth," I said, my voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "What the hell is going on here?" She stared at me, her eyes wide with shock, but there was something else there too, defiance. Michael stepped back, his hand still resting on the small of her back, as if he was ready to protect her from me. "Nothing," she replied, her voice cold and dismissive. "We were just talking." "Talking?" I repeated, my voice rising. "In front of a motel in the middle of the night? How stupid do you think I am?" Beth crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes narrowing. "You're overreacting. I'm allowed to have friends, you know." "Friends?" I spat the word like it was poison. "Is that what you call this? Sneaking around behind my back with this taxi driver?" Michael's expression hardened, but he said nothing, his hand dropping from Beth's back. I could see the anger in his eyes, but he held himself in check, letting her do the talking. "You're being ridiculous," Beth said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I'm tired of you always accusing me of things I haven't done. Maybe if you weren't so damn paranoid, we wouldn't have these problems." "Paranoid?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You've been lying to me for weeks, maybe longer, And now you're trying to make this my fault? Beth rolled her eyes, her lip curling into a sneer. Maybe if you weren't such a boring, predictable loser, I wouldn't have to look elsewhere for some excitement. The words hit me like a slap in the face. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, the shock and pain of her betrayal washing over me in waves. But then the anger took over, a red-hot fury that made my vision blur. So this is what you've been doing? I shouted, not caring who heard. Cheating on me with this lowlife? Michael finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. Watch your mouth, man. You don't know anything about me. I ignored him, my focus entirely on Beth. How long has this been going on? How long have you been lying to me? Beth shrugged, her expression indifferent. Does it really matter? It's over now. The finality of her words shattered something inside me. I felt like I was free-falling, the ground ripped out from under me. For so long, I had clung to the hope that things could get better, that we could fix whatever was broken between us. But now, I realized that was impossible. It was already too late. Without another word, I turned and walked back to my car, the rain washing away the tears I hadn't realized were falling. I could hear Beth calling after me, but I didn't stop. I didn't care anymore. I drove in a daze, the reality of what had just happened sinking in with every mile that passed. Beth was gone. The woman I had loved for so many years had turned into someone I didn't recognize, someone who could lie to my face and laugh behind my back. And now, she was with him. As I drove aimlessly through the rain-soaked streets, the anger inside me grew, turning into something dark and consuming. Beth had betrayed me, but it wasn't just her fault. Michael had played his part too, luring her away from me, taking what was mine. I thought about the look in his eyes, the smug satisfaction he had tried to hide when he saw me. He thought he had won, that he had taken everything from me. But he was wrong. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. As the night wore on, a plan began to form in my mind, a way to make him pay for what he had done. I knew it was dangerous, that it could go horribly wrong, but at that moment, I didn't care. I was beyond reason, beyond caring about consequences. All I knew was that I couldn't let this go, couldn't let him walk away unscathed after everything he had taken from me. By the time I got home, the plan was fully formed, and I knew exactly what I had to do. Tomorrow, I would confront Beth one last time, make her understand the gravity of her choices. And then, I would deal with Michael. He wouldn't see it coming, and when it was all over, when they had both paid the price for their betrayal, I would walk away from this nightmare and start over. Alone, but free. The rain had finally stopped by the time I pulled into the driveway, but the storm inside me was just beginning. I stepped out of the car and looked up at the sky, the clouds parting to reveal a sliver of the moon. It was a new beginning, a night that would change everything, and I was ready for it. The following morning, the world seemed unnaturally calm, as if the universe itself had taken a breath before the storm. I had barely slept, my mind consumed with thoughts of betrayal and revenge. The plan I had concocted in the early hours was all I could focus on, a dark determination guiding my every move. Beth was still in bed when I left the house. I didn't wake her. I didn't want to see her face, the face that had once been the center of my world, now nothing more than a mask hiding lies. My hands were steady as I drove to the store, picking up the supplies I needed, a canister of gasoline, matches, and a pair of work gloves. I paid in cash, avoiding the cashier's eyes, and left without a word. I spent the day in a fog, the routine of work providing little distraction from the dark thoughts that plagued me. Each passing hour felt like an eternity, but the plan was all that kept me going. I replayed the confrontation outside the motel over and over in my mind, each repetition feeding the fire of anger that had taken hold of me. Finally, the clock struck 5, and I left the office without a word to anyone. The drive home was a blur, my heart pounding in my chest as I approached the house. Beth's car was in the driveway, a sign that she was home. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. There was still time to deal with her. I needed to be smart, to keep my emotions in check. I parked a block away from our house and waited. I knew Michael's routine by now. He would pick Beth up after dinner, taking her wherever they went to indulge in their sick little affair. Sure enough, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I saw the familiar yellow taxi pull up in front of our house. Beth came out moments later, dressed in a tight black dress that hugged her curves in a way that used to drive me wild. Now, it just made me sick. She didn't see me as she hurried down the steps and slid into the passenger seat, leaning over to kiss Michael as soon as the door closed behind her. I waited until they pulled away before starting the car. I followed them at a distance, careful to stay out of sight. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, but I didn't care. All that mattered was what I was about to do. They drove through the city, heading to the outskirts where the streets were darker, less crowded. I knew where they were going, the same motel as last night. A seedy, forgotten place that matched the filth of their affair. I parked a short distance away, far enough that they wouldn't notice me but close enough to see everything. My heart pounded in my ears as I watched them get out of the taxi and disappear into the motel. I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed the gasoline canister and gloves from the back seat and got out of the car. The cool night air did nothing to calm the fire burning inside me. I moved quickly, staying in the shadows as I approached the taxi. It was parked at the far end of the lot, out of sight from the motel office. My hands shook slightly as I unscrewed the cap of the gasoline canister, but I pushed the nerves aside. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. I started pouring the gasoline over the hood of the taxi, the smell sharp and overpowering in the night air. I worked quickly, dousing the car from front to back, making sure every inch was covered. When the canister was empty, I stepped back, my breathing heavy, and fished the matches out of my pocket. I struck one and watched as the small flame flickered to life, the orange glow dancing in the darkness. For a moment, I hesitated. The reality of what I was about to do hit me like a punch to the gut. But then I thought of Beth, of the lies, the betrayal, and the way she had laughed with him. The anger flared up again, stronger than before, and I tossed the match onto the car. The fire caught immediately, the gasoline igniting with a loud whoosh. Flames leaped up, consuming the car in a matter of seconds. The heat was intense, searing my skin even from a distance, but I couldn't look away. I watched as the taxi burned, the flames turning the night sky a bright, angry orange. I didn't move until I heard the first crack of glass, the windshield shattering from the heat. Only then did I step back, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. I had done it. I had taken the first step in my revenge, and it felt good. The fire spread quickly, and I knew it wouldn't be long before someone noticed. I needed to get out of there before that happened. I turned and walked back to my car, forcing myself not to run. Panic tried to creep in, but I shoved it down. I had to stay calm. I had to be smart. I drove away, keeping my eyes on the road, not daring to look back at the burning taxi. I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins, my heart racing with the thrill of what I had just done. But there was no satisfaction, only a hollow emptiness that settled in my chest as the reality of my actions began to sink in. When I got home, Beth was still out. I sat in the dark, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over. The image of the burning car was seared into my memory, a vivid reminder of the path I had chosen. But instead of the relief I had hoped for, all I felt was a gnawing sense of dread. Hours passed, and still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a line, one that I could never come back from. The anger that had driven me earlier was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping fear. What if someone had seen me? What if the fire spread and someone got hurt? What if Beth found out? The sound of a key in the door jolted me out of my thoughts. Beth walked in, looking flushed and happy, her cheeks pink from the cold night air. She didn't notice me sitting in the shadows, too busy humming some tune to herself as she kicked off her shoes and headed for the bedroom. I watched her go, my heart heavy with the weight of what I had done. I knew I should feel triumphant, but all I felt was a deep, overwhelming regret. The fire had burned away the anger, leaving behind nothing but ashes. Beth paused at the bedroom door and turned to look at me, a puzzled expression on her face. "Why are you sitting in the dark?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence. I didn't answer, my mind too full of the flames and the destruction I had unleashed. She shrugged and disappeared into the bedroom, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As the night stretched on, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The fire wasn't just a punishment for Michael. It was a warning. And if Beth found out what I had done, she'd know I wasn't the man she thought she could control. She'd know just how far I was willing to go. The question was, would she be afraid? Or would she finally show her true colors and reveal just how dangerous she could be? One thing was certain, the game had changed, and there was no going back. But the endgame was still a long way off, and I knew the worst was yet to come. The next day dawned with a deceptive calm. The sun shone brightly through the windows, casting a warm glow over the house that felt entirely out of place given the darkness that had taken hold of my life. Beth was in the kitchen, humming softly as she made breakfast, as if everything was normal. But nothing was normal anymore, not after last night. I sat at the table, staring blankly at the plate of food in front of me. My appetite had vanished, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease that only grew stronger with each passing minute. I had spent the night tossing and turning, unable to sleep as the weight of my actions pressed down on me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flames, heard the crackling of the burning taxi, and felt the heat against my skin. Beth glanced at me, her smile strained. "You're quiet this morning," she said, her voice casual, but I could hear the underlying tension. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired, that's all." She nodded, but I could see the suspicion flicker in her eyes. She knew something was off, but I wasn't ready to tell her. Not yet. The fear that she might somehow already know about the fire gnawed at me, but I pushed it down. I needed to stay calm, to keep up the facade until I could figure out what to do next. As I picked at my food, Beth's phone buzzed on the counter. She quickly snatched it up, glancing at the screen before her eyes darted back to me. I couldn't help but notice the way she turned slightly away, shielding the phone from my view. "Who's that?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Just a friend," she replied quickly, her fingers flying over the screen as she typed out a response. "Nothing important." I watched her for a moment, the tension between us thickening. There was a time when she would have told me everything, shared every detail of her life with me. But now, she was keeping secrets, hiding things behind that pretty smile I had once loved so much. The sound of a notification chimed again, and she frowned at her phone, her expression shifting to one of concern. She hesitated, then put the phone down on the counter, deliberately placing its screen down. "I've got to run some errands," she said suddenly, grabbing her coat. "I'll be back later." "Where are you going?" I asked, trying to keep the anxiety out of my voice. "Just out," she replied vaguely, already heading for the door. "Don't wait up for me." I watched her leave, the door closing behind her with a soft click. The unease in my stomach twisted into something sharper, more urgent. I needed to know what was going on, what she was hiding. And I needed to find out if she knew about the fire. As soon as I heard her car pull out of the driveway, I jumped up from the table and grabbed her phone. My hands were shaking as I entered the passcode, praying she hadn't changed it. The screen unlocked, and I quickly scrolled through her messages, searching for anything that might give me a clue. Most of the messages were mundane, conversations with friends and coworkers that didn't seem out of the ordinary. But then I found one thread that made my blood run cold. It was a series of texts from Michael. "Michael, are you okay?" "Beth, yeah, just freaked out." "You, Michael, same." The fire was insane. "We need to be careful." "Beth, I know. I'm so scared." "What if he finds out?" "Michael, he won't. Just stay calm. We'll get through this." I stared at the messages, my heart pounding in my chest. So she did know. She knew about the fire, and she was scared. But what did that mean? Did she know that I was the one who had done it? Or was she afraid of something else? I kept scrolling, trying to find more clues, but the messages abruptly ended there. I cursed under my breath, the frustration boiling over as I slammed the phone down on the counter. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what this all meant. The fear in her messages was real, but it didn't seem to be directed at me specifically. It was as if she was afraid of something, or someone else. But who? And then it hit me. What if it wasn't just me she was hiding from? What if there was more to this than just her affair with Michael? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I had been so focused on the betrayal that I hadn't considered the possibility that there could be something bigger going on. The realization brought with it a new sense of urgency. I needed to find out what Beth and Michael were up to, and I needed to do it before it was too late. I couldn't just sit around and wait for the truth to come to me. I had to go after it. But first, I had to know if Beth had told Michael anything about me. If she suspected I was the one who set the fire, it would only be a matter of time before she either confronted me or went to the police. I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. I quickly got dressed and grabbed my keys, heading out the door with a renewed sense of purpose. I knew where Michael lived. It wasn't hard to find out, considering how often he'd been picking Beth up from our house. If I could catch him alone, maybe I could get some answers. The drive to Michael's apartment was tense, my mind racing with possibilities. The streets were busy with the usual morning traffic, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was the confrontation that was coming, and what I might find out when I got there. I parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, my nerves on edge. Michael lived in a modest apartment building, the kind that blended into the background of the city. I stood outside for a moment, gathering my courage before heading up to his floor. As I reached his door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorbell. This was it. The moment of truth. I took a deep breath and pressed the button, the sound of the chime echoing in the hallway. There was a long pause, and for a moment, I thought he might not answer. But then I heard footsteps approaching, and the door swung open. Michael stood there, his expression shifting from surprise to suspicion the moment he saw me. He was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, casual and relaxed, but there was a tension in his posture that betrayed his unease. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low and guarded. "I need to talk to you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can I come in?" He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if weighing his options. Finally, he stepped aside, motioning for me to enter. The apartment was small and cluttered, a stark contrast to the pristine image he projected as a taxi driver. The living room was a mess of papers, clothes, and empty takeout containers, and the air was heavy with the smell of stale cigarettes. "Make it quick," Michael said, closing the door behind me. "I've got things to do." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "I know about the fire," I said bluntly, watching his reaction closely. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought he might deny it. But then he let out a short, humorless laugh. "So you found out," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "What are you going to do about it?" I took a step closer, my fists clenched at my sides. "I want to know what's going on. Why were you and Beth talking about being careful? What aren't you telling me?" Michael's expression hardened, and he crossed his arms over his chest. "You don't know what you're getting into, man. This is bigger than you think." "Bigger?" I repeated, a chill running down my spine. "What are you talking about?" But before he could answer, the sound of a door opening down the hall caught my attention. I turned just in time to see Beth step out of the bathroom, her face pale and drawn. She froze when she saw me, her eyes widening in shock. "You!" she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing." I shot back, my anger flaring up again. "What the hell is going on, Beth? What have you been hiding from me?" She didn't answer, her eyes darting between me and Michael, her expression one of pure panic. It was then that I realized just how deep the deception went, how much she had been keeping from me. But before I could press her for answers, there was a sudden, sharp knock on the door. We all turned to look, a sense of dread settling over the room. Michael's face went white, and Beth took a step back, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Who is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Michael didn't answer. Instead, he moved to the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. I watched in horror as the door swung open, revealing two men in dark suits standing on the other side. Their expressions were cold, their eyes scanning the room with calculated precision. "Mr. Johnson," one of them said, his voice cold and authoritative. We need to have a word with you and Mrs. Beth. My heart sank as I realized that whatever was going on, it was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The men stepped into the apartment, their presence filling the small space with an oppressive weight. Beth's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something other than anger or indifference in them. It was fear, pure, unfiltered fear, and that was when I knew, whatever Beth and Michael had gotten themselves into, it was far more than just an affair. The fire, the lies, the secrets, they were all part of something much bigger, something that was about to consume us all, and there was no way out. But before I could process it, before I could ask the questions burning in my mind, one of the men spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You've been involved in something you shouldn't have," he said, his eyes locked on Michael. "And now you're going to pay the price." The room exploded into chaos, and in that moment, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The silence after the men entered Michael's apartment was suffocating. I stood frozen, my mind racing to process what was happening. Beth, who just minutes ago seemed so confident in her lies, was now trembling, her face pale with fear. Michael's bravado had evaporated, replaced by a look of dread. The two men in suits, cold and detached, commanded the room with an unsettling authority. "Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Beth," the man who had spoken earlier said again, his tone calm but threatening. "You've made some dangerous decisions. We're here to ensure you understand the consequences." I glanced at Beth, who avoided my gaze. My heart pounded in my chest. What had they gotten involved in? What was this really about? I don't know what you're talking about," Beth stammered, her voice shaky. She glanced at Michael, who was staring at the floor, his face tight with fear. The second man stepped forward, his expression hard. "Don't play dumb. We've been following you two for a while now. You're not as clever as you think." A knot tightened in my stomach. This was more than just an affair. Beth and Michael had gotten themselves involved in something dangerous, and now I was caught in the middle of it. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. I needed answers, now. The man turned his gaze to me, his eyes cold and calculating. "You must be the husband," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'd advise you to stay out of this if you know what's good for you." "Stay out of what?" I shot back, my frustration boiling over. "What the hell is going on here?" The man's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Your wife and her friend here have been meddling in things that don't concern them. They've been trying to pay off debts they couldn't cover by getting involved in some rather shady business deals." I felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't just about infidelity. It was something far more sinister. Beth and Michael had gotten tangled up with people who wouldn't hesitate to use violence to get what they wanted. "Debts?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded slowly. "They owe quite a sum of money to some very unpleasant people. And instead of coming to us directly, they tried to pull off a little scheme of their own. That scheme failed, and now they owe more than ever." I turned to Beth, my shock turning to anger. "Is this true? You've been lying to me about more than just your affair?" She nodded weakly, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The woman I had trusted, the woman I had built a life with, had not only betrayed me with another man, but had also dragged us both into a dangerous mess that could cost us everything. "What do you want from us?" I asked the men, my mind racing for a way out of this nightmare. "We're here to collect," the man said simply. "If they don't pay what they owe, things are going to get ugly." Beth gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Michael finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "We can get the money," he said quickly. "Just give us a little more time." The man shook his head. "Time's up. You either pay, or we take what's ours by force." I felt a surge of anger. This was all Beth's doing, her lies, her greed, her betrayal. She had put us in this position, and now we were both at risk because of her reckless choices. But as much as I wanted to let her face the consequences of her actions, I knew I couldn't just stand by and watch. If these men were as dangerous as they seemed, they wouldn't hesitate to hurt her, or worse. Despite everything, part of me still couldn't bear the thought of seeing her come to harm. How much do they owe? I asked, trying to buy us some time. The man gave me a hard look. More than you've got, I'm sure. Try me. He hesitated, then finally said, $200,000. The number hit me like a punch to the gut. There was no way we could come up with that kind of money on short notice. Beth and Michael had dug themselves into a hole too deep to climb out of. Give us a week, I said, desperation creeping into my voice. We can get the money. Just give us a little more time. The man glanced at his partner, who gave a slight nod. Fine, he said. You've got 1 week. But if you don't have the money by then, we'll be back. And trust me, you don't want that. With that, the men turned and left the apartment, the door closing behind them with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Beth sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Michael slumped against the wall, his face pale and drawn out. I stood there, numb, unable to comprehend how everything had gone so horribly wrong. The life I had known, the marriage I had trusted, was gone. In its place was a tangled web of lies, betrayal, and danger that I had never seen coming. The week that followed was the longest of my life. Every hour seemed to drag on endlessly, weighed down by the dread of what was to come. Beth and I barely spoke, the tension between us too thick to cut through. She spent most of her time locked in the bedroom, crying or on the phone, making frantic calls that I suspected were more desperate attempts to fix the unfixable. I couldn't stand being in the house, suffocated by the reminders of the life we once had and the mess it had become. Instead, I threw myself into trying to solve the problem, a problem I hadn't even created but was now fully entrenched in. The first thing I did was meet with a lawyer, someone I trusted enough to handle the sensitive nature of the situation. He was shocked by what I told him but agreed to help. We discussed potential ways to raise the money, but $200,000 wasn't something I could just pull out of thin air. We explored options, selling the house, liquidating assets. But even if I could do all that, it wouldn't be enough, and more importantly, it wouldn't be fast enough. Michael was no help. He was too wrapped up in his own fear to think straight. I met with him once after the men's visit, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He admitted that he had borrowed the money from dangerous people, hoping to make a quick return by gambling on some high-risk investments. Of course, those investments had failed, leaving him and, by extension, Beth, in the crosshairs of people who didn't forgive or forget. You've got to help me, man, Michael pleaded during our meeting. We were sitting in his dingy apartment, the same place where everything had started to unravel. His voice was shaky, his eyes darting around as if he expected the men to burst through the door at any moment. I don't know what to do. I wanted to hit him, to scream at him for dragging us into this nightmare. But instead I kept my cool, knowing that getting angry wouldn't solve anything. You need to stay calm, I told him, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. We need to figure out a way to get the money. He nodded, but I could see the defeat in his eyes. He had no plan, no ideas, and certainly no resources to pull off something like this. It was clear that if we were going to survive this, the burden would fall on me. I left his apartment more frustrated than before, my mind swirling with thoughts of what to do next. The deadline was looming, and I was running out of time and options. The weight of the situation bore down on me, a constant reminder that my life had spiraled completely out of control. As the week went on, I began to notice that Beth was spending more time on the phone, but she was careful not to let me overhear her conversations. Her behavior became increasingly erratic, swinging between bouts of frantic activity and moments of eerie calm. It was like she was clinging to some sliver of hope, but I had no idea what that could be. Then, 3 days before the deadline, Beth came to me with a new plan. I can get the money, she said, her voice trembling with both fear and determination. But I need you to trust me. I stared at her, incredulous. How? We've exhausted every option. Where are you going to get $200,000? She hesitated, biting her lip as if she was weighing her words carefully. There's someone I know, someone who can help. But it's risky. Risky? I repeated, anger flaring up inside me. Riskier than what we're already in? Beth nodded, her eyes pleading with me to understand. Yes, but it's our only chance. I can't tell you all the details, but you have to trust me. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, with no choice but to jump. Every instinct told me not to trust her, not after everything that had happened. But the desperation in her voice, the way she was holding on to this one last hope, made me pause. What's the plan? I asked, my voice flat. She took a deep breath. There's a man I used to know, before you and I got together. He deals in things that aren't exactly legal, but he's got the money and the connections to help us out of this. I've reached out to him, and he's willing to meet. My stomach turned at the thought of Beth turning to someone from her past, someone she clearly had kept secret from me all these years. But I pushed the feeling aside. We were out of options, and if this was our only chance, I had to take it. When and where? I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. Tomorrow night, at his place, she replied, relief washing over her face. But he only wants to meet with me. It has to be just me, no, I said immediately. I'm coming with you. Beth shook her head. He won't agree to that. He's paranoid, careful about who he trusts. If I show up with someone else, the deal's off. I could see the determination in her eyes, the desperation to make this work. I hated the idea of letting her go alone, especially given everything that had happened, but I knew she was right. This was a delicate situation, and I couldn't risk blowing it by insisting on being there. Fine, I said finally. But if anything goes wrong, you call me. Immediately, I will, she promised, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. The next day was agonizing. I spent the entire day pacing the house, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leaped into my throat, fearing the worst. But there was nothing, no word from Beth until the evening when she left for the meeting. I watched her drive away, feeling like I was letting her walk into a trap. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one adding to the mounting tension. I tried to distract myself, but nothing could take my mind off what was happening. Every worst-case scenario played out in my head, each one more terrifying than the last. An hour passed. Then too. My anxiety grew with each passing minute, and I began to worry that something had gone terribly wrong. I was on the verge of calling her when my phone finally rang. Beth? I answered immediately, my voice tense with worry. It's done, she said, her voice weak but relieved. I got the money. We're going to be okay. I sagged against the wall, the tension draining out of me in a rush of relief. Thank God, I muttered, barely able to believe it. I'm on my way back now, she said. We can pay them off tomorrow, and this will all be over. But as I hung up the phone, a nagging feeling tugged at the back of my mind. The relief was there, but so was the unease. Where had she gotten the money? What had she promised in return? And most importantly, was it really over? When Beth returned home, she was visibly shaken but trying to put on a brave face. She handed me the cash, a thick stack of bills that she had stashed in a duffel bag. Here it is, she said, her voice trembling. All we need to do is give it to them, and we're free. I took the bag from her, but something about the whole situation felt off. I didn't want to question her, not after everything we'd been through, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't out of the woods yet. The next morning, we prepared to meet the men. The plan was simple: hand over the money and make it clear that we were done with whatever mess Beth and Michael had gotten into. I had no intention of getting involved in anything more than I already was. I just wanted this nightmare to be over. But as we drove to the meeting spot, the tension in the car was palpable. Beth was quiet, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. I could tell she was nervous, and it only added to my own unease. We arrived at a secluded parking lot on the outskirts of town, the perfect spot for a deal that needed to stay off the radar. The two men were already there, leaning against a black SUV, their faces hidden in the shadows. Michael was nowhere in sight, and I wondered if he had bailed, too scared to face the consequences of his actions. I stepped out of the car, the duffel bag in hand, and walked over to the men. Beth stayed behind, her eyes fixed on me, watching anxiously. Here's the money, I said, holding up the bag. This settles the debt. We're done. The man who had spoken to us before stepped forward, taking the bag from me. He unzipped it and quickly rifled through the bills, nodding with satisfaction. Looks like you came through after all, he said, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. I breathed a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. One more thing, the man said, his tone suddenly shifting to something colder. There's been a change of plans. My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? He glanced over his shoulder at the SUV, and the back door opened. Michael was dragged out by two more men, his face bruised and bloodied. He was barely conscious, slumping in their grip as they hauled him toward us. Michael! Beth cried out from the car, her voice filled with horror. The man holding the bag turned back to me, his expression hard. Your friend here thought he could skip town, but we found him. He's going to take the fall for this, but we need a little insurance that you two won't cause any more problems. My blood ran cold as I realized what he was saying. This wasn't over. It was never going to be over. You can't do this, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We paid you. We're square. The man shook his head. It's not about the money anymore. It's about making sure you stay quiet. We'll be in touch. Before I could respond, they tossed Michael into the back of the SUV like a rag doll and slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life, and within seconds they were gone, leaving Beth and me standing in the empty parking lot, the weight of the situation crashing down on us. Beth stumbled out of the car, tears streaming down her face. What are we going to do? She whispered, her voice choked with fear. I didn't have an answer. The relief of having the money had been replaced by a cold, hard truth. This wasn't just about a debt. It was about control, power, and making sure we were too scared to ever cross them again. As we stood there, the realization sank in. This was far from over. And whatever came next, I knew we were completely unprepared for it. Bye-bye.